They say scary stories can't hurt you, but people who believe that don't sleep so well anymore. You're about to hear something most wouldn't dare listen to at night. And the more you listen, the closer it gets. So before sleep steals your memory, hit like and subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? It helps me bring the next story even closer to you. I've been a forest ranger at Blackwood National Park for nearly 17 years now. Most people think it's a lonely job, but I've always preferred the company of ancient trees to people. There's something about the whispers of leaves and the wind that feels more honest than any human conversation I've ever had. Have you ever stood in the middle of a dense forest during rainfall? The way the droplets create a symphony as they hit different surfaces. The hollow thud on fallen logs, the gentle patter on leaves, the splashing in puddles forming around exposed roots. It's quite meditative. At least, it used to be for me. Not anymore. It was late October, and we'd had weeks of relentless rain, the kind that soaks into your bones and never quite leaves. The forests in northern England can be particularly unforgiving this time of year. The days already shortening, the skies permanently gray, as if the sun had given up trying to penetrate the clouds. That evening, I was finishing my usual patrol of the eastern trails. We had reports of illegal camping in that area, and with the weather being what it was, I was concerned about the fire hazards. Soddenwood creates more smoke, you see, and smoke draws attention. People desperate enough to camp in these conditions would likely be desperate enough to ignore the warnings about fires. The rain had been falling steadily all day, but as dusk approached, it intensified. Fat droplets hammered against my waterproof jacket. The sound oddly amplified in the growing darkness. My torch beam cut through the gloom, catching raindrops in its light and making them appear like falling silver needles. I was about 2 miles from the ranger station when I noticed something peculiar on my handheld radio. Every few minutes, there would be a burst of static, followed by what sounded like a voice, too distant, too distorted to make out any words. I initially dismissed it as interference in the storm, but there was something about the rhythm of it that felt deliberate, like someone trying to communicate. Ranger Station Alpha, this is Matthews on the Eastern Trail. Are you trying to reach me? Over. I spoke into the radio, my breath visible in the cold air. No response. Just that same static, then silence. I'd been doing this job long enough to trust my instincts, and something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet beneath the rainfall. Normally, even in poor weather, you'd hear the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures, the hooting of owls preparing for their nightly hunt. But there was nothing except the rain and my own increasingly unsteady breathing. The rational part of my mind told me to head back to the station. My shift was nearly over, and the weather was only worsening. But that static burst came again, and this time I was certain I heard words. Help, Hollow Trail, please. The Hollow Trail was an unofficial name for an old logging path that had fallen into disuse years ago. The park didn't maintain it. It wasn't on any tourist maps. Only the long-term staff and some locals knew about it. It ran about half a mile east of where I was standing. This is Ranger Matthews. Please identify yourself and your location. Over. I tried again, my voice firmer this time. More static. Then, so clearly it made my skin prickle. I'm lost. Help me? A child's voice. Young. Frightened. My heart dropped into my stomach. What in God's name was a child doing out here, in this weather at this hour? The nearest campsite was 5 miles away, and the hiking trails have been closed due to the risk of flooding. I'm on my way. Keep talking so I can find you. What's your name? Are you alone? Over. I was already changing course, heading toward the hollow trail. The beam of my torch swept frantically through the trees, the shadows seeming to move and shift with each step I took. The radio crackled again. Cold, so cold. I quickened my pace, my boots slipping on the muddy ground. The rain was coming down in sheets now, reducing visibility to just a few meters ahead. But I knew these woods better than anyone. Even in these conditions, I could navigate them. The hollow trail wasn't easy to find if you didn't know what to look for. The entrance was partially hidden behind a cluster of young birch trees, their white trunks ghostly in the darkness. As I approached, I noticed something that made me pause. Footprints, small ones, leading into the trail. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the sound of rain hitting the forest canopy. "Forest Ranger. Call out if you can hear me." Nothing. I followed the footprints, noting with growing concern how they seemed too perfect, too evenly spaced for a child who was supposedly lost and frightened. They didn't meander or double back as you'd expect. They led straight down the trail, as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. The hollow trail earned its name from the way it dipped into a slight valley, creating a tunnel-like effect with the trees arching overhead. Even in daylight, it was a gloomy passage. At night, in the rain, it was like entering the throat of some massive beast. My radio crackled again. "Almost here. Come closer." The voice had changed somehow, still childlike, but with an undercurrent that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. There was an eagerness to it now, an anticipation. I stopped walking. "Who is this?" "Over." My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. No response. I shone my torch beam further down the trail. The footprints continued, but something about them seemed off. I crouched down to examine them more closely, the mud soaking through my trouser knees. They weren't sinking into the mud properly. They were impressions on the surface, as if someone had pressed a mold into the ground rather than actually walk there. A crash of thunder directly overhead made me jump. When I looked back down, the beam of my torch caught something reflective in the mud about 20 meters ahead. Something small and metallic. I approached cautiously, every sense on high alert. As I got closer, I realized what was a handheld radio identical to mine. It was partially buried in the mud, its red operation light blinking steadily. I picked it up, turning it over my hand. It was one of ours, all right. The Blackwood Ranger Service insignia was etched into the back, but it was an older model, one we hadn't used in years. The radio in my hand suddenly burst to life. "You found me." The voice was directly in my ear now. No static, no distance. Clear as if the speaker were standing right beside me. But there was no one there. Just trees and rain and darkness. I dropped the radio as if it had burned me. It hit the ground with a dull thud, sinking slightly into the mud. And then it laughed. A high, childlike giggle that twisted into something else midway. Something older, raspier. I backed away, my torch beam darting frantically around the trail. That's when I noticed them. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the light back at me from between the trees. Not animal eyes. They were too high off the ground, too unblinking. They were watching me, had been watching me all along. The old radio in the mud spoke again, but this time, it wasn't the child's voice. It was deeper, resonant, like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "Ranger Matthews, we've been waiting for you." My own radio, the one still clipped to my belt, came to life then, but instead of static or that eerie voice, it was my colleague, Ranger Davis from the station. Matthews, where are you? You're an hour overdue. The storm's getting worse. Over. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Those eyes were still watching, unblinking, from the tree line. And now I could see shapes emerging, tall, slender forms, too rigid to be human, too deliberate in their movements to be trees swaying in the wind. Matthews, do you copy? Your GPS shows you're on the old logging path. That area is not stable in this weather. Get out of there. Over. His voice snapped me back to reality. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers numb with cold and fear. Davis. I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. There's something. The fallen radio at my feet interrupted, its voice now a mocking mimicry of my own. Davis, there's something. The shapes were moving closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. In the brief flashes of lightning, I caught glimpses of them, tall, skeletal figures with elongated limbs and features that were almost but not quite human. I need backup, I said into my radio, already backing away, keeping my torch trained on the approaching figures. Eastern Trail, the old logging path. Now, what's happening? Over. Davis sounded alarmed. Before I could respond, a bolt of lightning struck a tree not 30 meters from where I stood. The thunderous crack was immediate, deafening. In the brilliant flash, I saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't human, weren't animal, weren't anything I had words for. Their bodies were like twisted, elongated mannequins, joints bent at impossible angles. Their faces, God, their faces were blank expanses of bark-like skin with just those reflective eyes and gaping, hollow openings where mouths should be. And they were coming towards me, moving with the jerky rhythm of stop-motion animation. I ran, abandoned all protocol, all training, and just ran. The mud sucked at my boots. The rain lashed at my face. Branches whipped and scratched at my skin. But I didn't slow down. Couldn't. Behind me, that chorus of voices called out, using the abandoned radio as their instrument. Ranger Matthews, why are you running? We just want to talk. Their laughter echoed through the trees, harmonizing with the thunder in a way that seemed to make the very air vibrate. I don't know how long I ran for. Time seemed to stretch and compress, measured only in the pounding of my heart and the ragged gasps of my breathing. At some point, I heard engines, the ATVs from the ranger station. Davis must have mobilized a search party. The beams of their headlights cut through the darkness ahead of me, and I changed course to intercept them. The voices and the strange figures seemed to recede the closer I got to those lights. When I finally stumbled into the path of the lead ATV, I collapsed. Davis and Johnson had to carry me back to the vehicle, my legs no longer able to support my weight. I was babbling, I'm told, about voices and eyes and things in the woods. They attributed it to hypothermia and shock. Said I must have slipped, hit my head. That would explain the deep gash they found at my temple, the one I hadn't even noticed in my panic. They said the radio interference was just a storm, that I had imagined the child's voice, the watching eyes, those things, and maybe they're right. Maybe it was all a hallucination brought on by injury and the isolation of the forest at night. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling as rain patters against my windows. When they found me, my uniform was covered in mud and scratches from my frantic flight through the forest. But there was something else, too. Handprints. Small ones, like a child's, pressed into the fabric of my jacket. Not random smears from a fall, but deliberate impressions. 5 perfectly formed fingers on each print. I haven't gone back to the hollow trail since that night. I requested a transfer to the western section to park, as far from that logging path as possible. The official report lists the incident as a minor injury due to adverse weather conditions. But sometimes, on nights when the rain is heavy and the wind howls through the trees, my radio will pick up bursts of static. And in that static, if I listen carefully, I can hear them. Ranger Matthews, come back and play. Would you have gone back? Would you have tried to find a rational explanation? Or would you, like me, choose to stay as far away as possible from the hollow trail? And whatever waits there in the rain and darkness, I still work as a ranger. Still love the forest during the day, when sunlight filters through the leaves and the only sounds are birds and the occasional hiker passing by. But I never patrol alone at night anymore, especially when it rains, because I know they're still out there, waiting, watching with those unblinking eyes. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed listening to the rainfall outside my window, I wonder if they're watching me even now. If those elongated figures are standing just beyond the glass, their hollow mouths forming my name. I wonder if they follow me home. Are you listening to this in the dark? Is it raining where you are? Perhaps you should check your windows. Make sure they're locked, just to be safe. Do you ever feel like you're being watched? Not in the paranoid sense, but that primal sensation that crawls up your spine when something's eyes are fixed upon you. I used to dismiss that feeling, a survival instinct, I told myself, an evolutionary hangover from when we needed to be alert to predators. Now, I know better. I've been a forest ranger at Elmridge Nature Reserve for 11 years. It's a vast stretch of ancient woodland in the north of England, largely untouched for centuries. Most visitors stick to the designated paths, the maintained trails that wind through the more picturesque sections. But my job takes me to the places they never see, the dense, forgotten corners where the trees grow so close together that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. The locals call one particular section the Whisper Woods. It's a name that predates the nature reserve, going back to old village records. I never thought much of it until 3 months ago. Now I can't think of anything else. It was early November. We'd had nearly 2 weeks of nonstop rain, the sort that doesn't pour so much as it hangs in the air, a constant misty drizzle that soaks everything. The ground had turned to mud, and we were concerned about flooding in the lower sections of the reserve. That evening, I was tasked with checking the drainage channels in the northern quadrant, right through the heart of the Whisper Woods. It should have been a routine patrol, for hours at most. I set out at around 5 o'clock. The sun was already setting, the gray daylight fading quickly to an inky blue twilight. My torch beam cut through the gathering darkness as I made my way along the maintenance track, the sound of rain on my waterproof hood creating a constant, soothing backdrop. The trouble with rain in a forest is that it changes the acoustics. Sounds don't travel the same way. They become muffled, distorted. Perhaps that's why I didn't immediately notice anything unusual about the voices. At first, I thought it was just water dripping from the canopy overhead, or maybe the wind moving through the branches. But as I ventured deeper into the Whisper Woods, I began to distinguish patterns in the sound, rhythms that were too regular, too deliberate to be natural. I stopped walking and switched off my torch. Sometimes when you remove one sense, the others compensate. I stood perfectly still listening. Whispers, dozens of them, overlapping, surrounding me, too faint to make out words, but distinctly human in their cadence. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed forest. This is Ranger Collins. Is someone there? The whispers stopped immediately. The forest fell silent, except for the gentle patter of rain. I switched my torch back on, the beam catching the raindrops as they fell through the darkness. There was no one in sight, just trees, their trunks slick with rain, their branches hanging low under the weight of water. Must be getting paranoid in my old age, I muttered to myself, continuing along the path. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest felt different now, alert, aware. I've spent enough time in woodland to know that it has moods, personalities even, and right now, it felt like the Whisper Woods was holding its breath. I reached the first drainage channel about 20 minutes later. It was flowing well, carrying the excess water down toward the valley floor. I made a note in my logbook, the pages curling slightly with the damp despite my efforts to keep it dry. That's when I noticed the footprints. They crossed my path about 10 yards ahead, small barefoot impressions in the mud, heading east into the densest part of the woods. Child-sized, my heart sank. A lost child out here. In this weather, with night falling, it was a ranger's worst nightmare. I radioed back to base immediately, Collins to control. I found what appeared to be a child's footprints in the Whisper Woods section, heading east off the trail. Recent, requesting backup for search and rescue. Over. The radio crackled with static for a moment before Controller Davies responded. Control to Collins. Are you certain they're fresh? There's no report of any missing persons in the area. Over. I crouched down, examining the prints more closely. The edges were sharp, not washed out by the rain. Affirmative. They're fresh. Can't be more than an hour old. I'm going to follow them. Send backup to my coordinates. Over. Copy that. Backup is on the way. Maintain radio contact. Over. I began following the footprints, my torch beam fixed on the trail of small impressions leading into the undergrowth. It made no sense. The nearest car park was over 3 miles away. How had a child wandered this far into reserve without anyone noticing? The vegetation grew thicker as I moved away from the path, branches catching on my clothing, thorns scratching at my exposed skin. The rain intensified, drumming against the leaves overhead like impatient fingers. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. I stopped again, listening. There was a pattern to them, almost like a conversation, but just beyond the threshold of comprehension. It was maddening, like trying to tune a radio to a frequency that kept slipping away. Hello, I called again. I'm here to help. Is someone there? The whispers ceased, replaced by a single, clear voice directly behind me. Why are you following me? I spun around, my torch beam cutting through the darkness. A little girl stood there, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wearing a pale blue dress that was soaked through. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face. Her feet were bare and muddy. Are you lost? I asked, keeping my voice calm and gentle. I'm a forest ranger. I can help you find your parents. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an unsettling intensity. I'm not lost. I live here. In the forest? I asked, confused. There were no residential properties within the reserve boundaries. She nodded solemnly. In the Whisper Woods, with the others. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down my spine. What others? Instead of answering, she turned and pointed deeper into the forest. They want to meet you. They've been watching you for a long time. I glanced in the direction she was pointing. There was nothing but darkness between the trees. When I looked back, she was gone. My torch beam swept frantically across the surrounding woodland. Hello? Where did you go? The radio at my belt crackled. Control to Collins. Backup is en route. ETA 15 minutes. What's your situation? Over. I fumble for the radio. My fingers numb with cold and a growing sense of dread. Collins to control. I've made contact with child. Female, approximately 8 years old, but she's disappeared again. I'm continuing to follow the footprints. Over. Copy that. Be advised, we still have no reports of missing children. Proceed with caution. Over. The footprints continued ahead of me, small and perfect in the mud. I followed them, my unease growing with each step. The whispers had returned, now seemingly coming from all directions, rising and falling like a tide. And I began to notice other footprints joining the child's. Adult size, dozens of them, converging from different directions. All barefoot, all fresh. The trees began to thin out, and suddenly I found myself on the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its massive trunk gnarled and twisted with age. The footprints led directly to it, but what made my blood run cold were carvings, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the trunk up to about 7 feet off the ground. Names, dates, some recent, others worn and weathered by time, and among them, freshly carved, was my own name. The whisper stopped. The forest fell silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then, from the darkness between the trees, they emerged. Figures, barely visible in the gloom. Men, women, children, standing perfectly still, watching me. Their clothes were different periods, some modern, others from decades or even centuries past. All soaked through, all barefoot, and all with the same blank, hollow expression. The little girl from before stepped forward, her eyes reflecting the beam of my torch like a cat's. "We've been waiting for you, Ranger Collins. We've saved a place for you." She gestured to the oak tree, to my name carved into its bark. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "We are the lost," she replied simply. "The forgotten, the ones the forest claimed." "I don't understand," I said, though a terrible suspicion was forming in my mind. She smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "You will. They all do. Eventually. The rain calls us. The whispers guide us. And the woods keep us." The figures began to move forward, closing in around me in a silent circle. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Stay back," I warned, though I knew instinctively that these, whatever they were, wouldn't be deterred by threats. My radio burst to life, making me jump. "Control to Collins. Backup is approaching your location. Do you copy? Over." The little girl's smile faltered. She looked up at the sky, where the rain was beginning to ease. "They're coming," she said, a note of disappointment in her voice. "And the rain is stopping. We must go." As if on cue, the figures began to retreat, melting back into the shadows between the trees. The little girl was the last to leave. "We'll be waiting, Ranger Collins," she said softly. "When the rain returns, when the whispers call, you'll come back to us then." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the clearing with that ancient oak and its carved names, mine among them. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before my colleagues found me. They said I was in shock, babbling about whispers and barefoot people in the woods. They found the clearing and the oak tree readily enough, but claimed there were no carvings on its trunk, no names, no dates, and certainly not mine. The footprints, too, had vanished, washed away by the rain, my colleague suggested. Or perhaps they'd never been there at all. The official report listed the incident as a case of disorientation due to poor visibility and adverse weather conditions. My supervisor recommended 2 weeks leave, which I took without argument. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Since that night, I've researched the history of Elm Ridge and the Whisper Woods. The records speak of people who went missing over the centuries, travelers, villagers, children who wandered too far from home, always during periods of heavy rainfall, always in or near that particular section of forest. I've been back to reserve since then, but I've never returned to the Whisper Woods. I request different patrol routes, different areas to monitor. My colleagues think I've developed a fear of that section after getting lost there. They're not entirely wrong. But the real reason I stay away is because I'm afraid I might go back to that oak tree. Afraid that I might find my name still carved into its trunk. Afraid that I might hear those whispers again, and this time, follow them willingly. It's raining tonight. I can hear it pattering against my bedroom window as I tell you this. A gentle, persistent rain that shows no signs of stopping. And beneath its rhythm, just on the edge of hearing, I swear I can make out whispers, calling my name, inviting me back. Sometimes I wonder, if you were in my position, would you go back? Would you seek answers? Or would you do as I've done and try to forget? And if the whispers ever called to you on a rainy night, would you have the strength to ignore them? I hope, for your sake, you never have to find out. The rain is getting heavier now. I think I'll turn the radio on, drown out any other sounds that might be trying to reach me. After all, it's just water falling from the sky, just the wind in the trees, isn't it? Have you ever been so completely and utterly alone that you begin to question if the rest of the world still exists? Not the comfortable solitude of a quiet evening at home, but the profound isolation that comes when you're miles from another human being, with nothing but wilderness surrounding you. There's a certain weight to that kind of loneliness, a pressure that builds in your chest until even the sound of your own breathing seems unnaturally loud. I've spent most of my career seeking out that solitude. 15 years as a forest ranger in the Thornwick Nature Reserve, a sprawling protected woodland in the north of England. Most rangers rotate between the busy visitor centers and the remote outposts, but I've always volunteered for the isolation assignments. The 4-day shift at observation points where your only company is the wildlife and the weather. At least, that's what I thought. It was early December, and we've been experiencing what the meteorologists call a sustained precipitation event. Nearly 2 weeks of constant rainfall that ranged from gentle drizzle to pounding downpours. The rivers were swollen. Trails had turned to muddy sluices. And we were on high alert for flooding and landslides. I was assigned to the Northern Watchtower, an old fire observation post built in the 1950s that stood on a ridge overlooking one of the most remote valleys in the reserve. For days of monitoring rainfall levels, checking for signs of landslides, and reporting back via radio every 6 hours. Standard procedure during extreme weather events. The drive to the tower access road took nearly 2 hours from headquarters. The last 40 minutes on a dirt track that the rain had transformed into a treacherous mud pit. Several times I thought my Land Rover would become hopelessly stuck. But eventually I made it to the small clearing where the access trail began. From there, it was a 30-minute hike uphill to the watchtower. By the time I reached the tower, I was soaked despite my waterproofs. The rain had worked its way into every seam and fold, running down my neck and into my boots. The tower itself was a simple structure, a square room about 12 feet on each side, perched atop a 30-foot steel framework. A narrow staircase spiraled up the outside to the observation room, which had windows on all four sides, offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding forest. Inside was sparse but functional. A desk with monitoring equipment, a camp bed, a small gas stove, a chemical toilet behind a privacy screen, and shelves stocked with enough supplies to last a week. Solar panels provided power for the equipment and a single overhead light, while a gas heater kept the worst of the chill at bay. I went through the standard arrival procedures, checking the equipment, radioing in to confirm my presence, and setting up my personal items. By the time I'd changed into dry clothes and made a cup of tea, dusk was settling over the forest. The rain drummed steadily on the metal roof, creating a hypnotic rhythm that will be my constant companion for the next 4 days. Through the windows, I could see the forest stretching for miles in every direction, an undulating sea of dark green made gray by the rain and fading light. Mist clung to the valleys and wound between the trees like ghostly serpents. It was beautiful in a melancholy sort of way. The first night passed uneventfully. I took readings every 2 hours, logged them, and caught snatches of sleep between alarms. The rain continued unabated, sometimes easing to a gentle patter, other times hammering against the roof with such force I feared the windows might crack. It was during my 4 a.m. reading that I first noticed something unusual. As I was recording precipitation levels, I caught a glimpse of light in the valley below, a small, flickering point of orange yellow, like a campfire. It vanished almost immediately, and I wondered if I'd imagined it, my tired mind playing tricks in the darkness. But no one should have been camping down there. That section of the reserve was closed to the public year-round, a protected habitat for several endangered species. The nearest authorized trail was 5 miles south. I made a note in the log and continued with my readings. When I radioed in at 6 a.m., I mentioned the light to headquarters. Probably just a reflection from your own lights, suggested Ranger Wilson, my contact at base. Or maybe sheet lightning in the distance, the storms intensifying over your sector. Maybe, I conceded, though neither explanation seemed right. There had been no lightning, and my lights weren't positioned in a way that would create reflections in that direction. Want us to send someone to check it out? Wilson asked, though I could tell from his tone that he wasn't keen on dispatching resources based on such a vague sighting. No, it's fine, I said. I'll keep an eye out. If I see it again, I'll let you know. The second day followed the same pattern. Reading instruments, logging data, brief radio check-ins. The rain, if anything, grew heavier. Visibility decreased as low clouds enveloped the tower, reducing my view of the forest to ghostly shapes in the mist. I didn't see the light again that day, but as night fell, I began to hear things. At first, I dismissed the sounds as the natural creaks and groans of the tower settling, the wind pushing against the structure, or branches from nearby trees scraping against the metal. But around midnight, as I sat at the desk updating the log, I heard what sounded unmistakably like footsteps on the metal staircase outside. Slow, deliberate steps, climbing steadily toward the observation room. I froze, pen hovering above paper, listening intently. The footsteps continued, clang, 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 each one slightly louder than the last, drawing nearer to the door. I reached for the powerful torch I kept by the desk and directed its beam through the window toward the staircase. Nothing. The steps were empty, glistening with rain. The sound stopped immediately. Hello? I called out, feeling slightly foolish. Is someone there? No response, just the constant drumming of rain. I opened the door and stepped out onto the small platform at the top of the stairs, shining my torch down into the darkness. The beam cut through the rain and mist, but revealed nothing unusual. Just empty steps all the way to the ground. Unnerved, but telling myself it had been some trick of the acoustics, I went back inside, secured the door, and tried to focus on my work. But now that I was listening for them, other sounds began to emerge from beneath the rainfall. Whispers. So faint I couldn't make out words, but distinctly human in their cadence and tone. They seemed to come from all around the tower, rising and falling like the murmuring of a distant crowd. I checked the radio, thinking perhaps I was picking up interference from some other channel. But it was off. The whispers continued, growing slightly louder as the night wore on, though never clear enough to distinguish individual words. Sleep became impossible. I sat at the desk with my back to the wall, torch in hand, watching the door and windows as the voices ebbed and flowed around me. Occasionally, footsteps would return, that same slow, methodical clang, clang, clang on the stairs. But each time I looked, there was nothing there. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The whispers had faded with the dawn, and I managed to doze for a couple of hours before my alarm reminded me it was time for the 8 a.m. readings. When I radioed in for my scheduled check-in, I debated whether to mention the strange occurrences. Would headquarters think I was losing my mind, suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations? In the end, I said nothing about the whispers or phantom footsteps, reporting only the standard meteorological data. The third day brought a brief respite in the weather. Around midday, the rain eased to a light drizzle, and some mist cleared from the valleys. I took the opportunity to step outside onto the observation platform, grateful for the fresh air after being cooped up in the small room. That's when I noticed the footprints in the mud around the base of the tower. Dozens of them, forming a perfect circle around the structure, all facing inward, as if a group of people had stood there, looking up at me. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp December air. I hurried back inside and radioed headquarters. "Wilson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "has anyone else been up the tower in the last 48 hours? "Negative," he replied after a moment. "Road conditions are too poor." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated. I found footprints around the tower. Fresh ones. There was a pause on the other end. Animal tracks, maybe? Deer often seek shelter under elevated structures during heavy rain. "These aren't deer," I insisted. "They're human footprints. A lot of them." Another pause, longer this time. "Look, Matthews," Wilson finally said, his voice lowered slightly as if he didn't want others in the office to hear. "That tower, it has a bit of a history. Nothing official in the records, but the old-timers talk sometimes." "What kind of history?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Back in '87, there was a ranger posted there during a similar weather system. 4-day assignment, just like yours. On the third day, his radio check stopped. When they sent someone to check on him, the tower was empty. No sign of a struggle. All his gear still there. But the ranger was gone. And they never found him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Never," Wilson confirmed. But here's the strange thing. Ever since then, rangers posted to that tower during heavy rainfall have reported unusual experiences. Sounds, lights in the forest. Some even claimed to hear footsteps on the stairs when there was nobody there. Why the hell wasn't I told this before coming up here? I demanded, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "Because it's not official," Wilson said defensively. "Just stories. Old Rangers' tales. Management doesn't acknowledge it, and most of us thought it was just, isolation playing tricks on people's minds. Well, Something is going on up here, I said firmly, and I'd like to be relieved of this post. I can't authorize that, Wilson replied. The access road is completely washed out now. No vehicle could make it through. You'll have to sit tight until your scheduled pickup tomorrow afternoon. I wanted to argue further, but I knew he was right. Even if they wanted to extract me, the conditions made it impossible. I was stuck here until the following day. Fine, I said tersely, but I expect a full explanation when I get back to headquarters. Of course, Wilson agreed, sounding relieved that I wasn't pushing harder. Just keep the doors locked tonight, yeah? After that conversation, the days seemed to drag endlessly. The rain returned with renewed intensity around mid-afternoon, reducing visibility once again to just a few yards beyond the tower. I found myself constantly checking the stairs and ground below, half expecting to see figures standing in that perfect circle, looking up at me. As darkness fell, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent, though still indecipherable. I tried drowning them out with music from my phone, but the battery died around 8 p.m., and I hadn't brought a charger. A rookie mistake that I cursed myself for repeatedly. At 10 p.m., as I was taking readings, the footsteps began again. Clang, 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 slow and deliberate on the metal stairs. But this time, they didn't stop when I showed my torch toward them. This time, they continued all the way to the top. I stood frozen by the desk, torch beam fixed on the door, as the footsteps reached the platform outside. There was a pause, a moment of terrible silence broken only by the rain and my own ragged breathing. And then a knock, 3 sharp raps on the metal door. Who's there? I called, my voice cracking slightly. Identify yourself. No answer. Just another 3 knocks, more insistent this time. I'm armed. I lied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I will defend myself if necessary. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought whatever was out there had gone. Then a voice spoke. So close it could have been standing right beside me inside the room. Let us in, Ranger Matthews. It wasn't one voice. I realized with growing horror. It was many voices speaking in perfect unison. Men, women, even children, all pronouncing each word with exactly the same inflection. We're cold, the voices continued. We're wet. We want to come inside. Who are you? I demanded, pressing my back against the far wall, as far from the door as the small space would allow. Friends, came the reply. Colleagues. We worked here just like you. We watched the forest. Then the forest started watching back. The door handle began to turn, slowly, though I was certain I had locked it. I lunged forward and grabbed it, holding it in position, feeling resistance on the other side. A steady, powerful pressure trying to force it down. Go away, I shouted. Leave me alone. We can't, the voices replied, calm and reasonable. Not without you. Not until we're complete. The pressure on the handle increased. Metal groaned against metal. I wasn't sure how long I could hold it. In desperation, I grabbed the radio with my free hand and called headquarters, not caring that it was well outside my scheduled check-in time. Emergency! I practically screamed into the handset. Tower North is under attack. I need immediate assistance. The radio crackled with static, then cleared, but the voice that responded wasn't Wilson. It wasn't anyone from headquarters. No one can hear you, Ranger Matthews, said those same unified voices, now coming from the radio in my hand. No one except us. I dropped the radio as if it had burned me. The handle beneath my other hand gave a sudden jerk, nearly wrenching free of my grip. Outside, more footsteps joined the first set, dozens of them climbing the stairs, the metal framework of the tower groaning under their collective weight. The windows darkened as figures pressed against the glass, silhouettes barely visible through the rain-streaked panes. Their features were indistinct, but I could make out hands pressing flat against the glass, leaving no prints or marks despite the rain. Just one night. The voices coax from all around me now. One night with us, and it will all make sense. You'll understand what we've seen, what we know. What happened to the Ranger in '87? I asked, stalling for time, though I had no plan beyond maintaining my grip on that handle until dawn. A sound like sighing wind moved through the room, though the air was still. He joined us. The voices said simply, "As many have before him, as you will. I won't." I insisted, though my arm was beginning to ache from the strain of holding the handle. "You already belong to us," the voices replied. "From the moment you saw our fire, from the moment you heard our steps, the tower has chosen you." The pressure on the handle suddenly ceased, causing me to stumble backward. For one hopeful moment, I thought they had given up. Then the entire tower began to shake. It started as a gentle vibration, like the rumble of distant thunder, but it quickly intensified until the whole structure was swaying, the metal framework screeching in protest. Books fell from shelves. Equipment crashed to the floor. The single overhead light flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness save for the beam of my torch. Through the windows, I could see figures climbing the framework itself now, crawling up the steel supports like spiders, their movements jerky and unnatural. The voices rose to a deafening chorus that somehow still formed coherent words. "Join U.S., Ranger Matthews. Become part of the Watchers." In that moment of pure terror, a strange clarity came over me. I remembered something Wilson had said, that the incident had occurred on the third day of that long-ago Ranger's watch. Today was my third day. Whatever ritual or pattern was unfolding required a specific timing. If I could just survive until morning, perhaps the opportunity would pass. Perhaps I would be safe. I braced myself against the desk as the tower continued to shake. The figures at the windows pressed harder against the glass, which began to crack under the pressure. The door handle turned violently back and forth, the hinges straining. I knew the tower, or my nerve, would give way long before dawn. And then I saw it, the light in the valley below. The same flickering orange glow I'd noticed that first night. But now it was larger, brighter, moving through the forest toward the tower. Not a campfire, something else. As if sensing my distraction, the assault on the tower intensified. The door began to splinter at the hinges. Glass cracked and fell in sharp shards onto the floor. Cold rain lashed into the broken windows, and with it came the reaching hands of the figures outside, pale, elongated fingers grasping at the air inches from where I stood. The light in the forest grew closer, brighter. I could see now that it was moving up the hillside toward the tower at impossible speed. In a moment of mad inspiration, I grabbed the gas canister from the heater, wrenched it free of its connections, and held it over my head. "Stay back!" I shouted at the encroaching figures. "I'll blow this whole tower to hell before I join you." The assault paused momentarily, as if the entities were considering my threat. Then, as one, they resumed their attack with even greater fury. The tower shook so violently I could barely keep my footing, just as the door finally gave way. The orange light from the forest reached the clearing below. It rose up like a pillar of flame, engulfing the base of the tower, climbing rapidly toward the observation room. The figures at the windows and door recoiled from it, their unified voices breaking into discordant shrieks of what sounded like pain or fear. The fiery light reached the platform outside the door, and through the splintered opening I glimpsed something within the flames. A figure, humanoid but not human, its form constantly shifting and changing as it composed of the fire itself. It spoke a single word in a voice like crackling timber. Mine. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The entities attacking the tower retreated, as if physically pushed back, their forms dissolving into darkness and rain. The violent shaking of the tower ceased, though the structure still swayed precariously, damaged by the assault. The fiery figure remained at the doorway, its heat intense but somehow not burning. It turned what might have been a face toward me, a swirling vortex of flame with points of deeper orange where eyes might be. "They have no claim on you," it said, its voice like a well-stoked hearth. Not while I watched these woods. Before I could respond, it was gone, not gradually fading, but instantly extinguished, as if someone had flipped a switch. The only evidence of its presence was a lingering warmth in the air and the faint smell of wood smoke. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the corner of the damaged observation room, torch clutched in one hand, gas canister in the other, listening to the rain and the creaking of the weakened tower. But the whispers didn't return. The footsteps didn't come again. Whatever confrontation I had witnessed seemed to have reached some sort of resolution, though I understood none of it. When dawn finally broke, I radioed headquarters, surprised to find the connection clear and strong. I reported structural damage to the tower from the storm, saying nothing of its true cause, and requested immediate evacuation. To my astonishment, Wilson informed me that road conditions had improved overnight, and that a vehicle was already on its way to collect me. 3 hours later, I was safely back at headquarters, giving a heavily edited account of my experiences that mentioned nothing of whispers, footsteps, or entities composed of fire. That was 4 months ago. I've since transferred to a different region entirely. A coastal reserve with open skies and few trees. I told my superiors I needed a change of scenery for my mental health. They didn't question it, but I've kept researching the Thornwick Tower in my spare time. The ranger who vanished in '87 wasn't the first. It turns out, every few decades, during periods of prolonged rainfall, someone goes missing from that spot. Local folklore speaks of the Watchers in the Wood, spirits or entities that covet human observers, that want to add to their number. And older still are legends of the Fire Walker, a guardian spirit that protects travelers from the Watchers, that claims certain parts of the forest as its domain. I don't know what I witnessed that night, whether it was mass hallucination brought on by isolation and stress, or something older, something for which we have no modern context or explanation. But I do know this. On rainy nights, I keep a candle burning in my window, a small gesture of gratitude, perhaps, or a reminder. Are you listening to this in the rain? Can you hear anything beneath its rhythm? Whispers, footsteps, voices calling your name? If you do, my advice is this: look for the light. Not all entities in the darkness wish you harm, but be careful which ones you invite in. After all, some watchers are watchful for a reason. You know that feeling when something's watching you? Not the paranoid sensation that comes in crowded places, but that primal, neck-prickling awareness that you're being observed? They say it's an evolutionary adaptation, that our ancestors needed to sense predators' eyes upon them to survive. I used to believe that explanation. Now I know better. I've been a forest ranger at Ravenscrag National Park for 22 years. It's one of the oldest protected woodlands in Britain, with parts of forest dating back over 1,000 years. Most visitors stick to the well-maintained trails near the visitor center, enjoying their brief communion with nature before returning to the comfort of central heating and Wi-Fi. But my job takes me to parts of the forest that tourists never see. The ancient, untouched sections where the trees grow so densely that midday feels like dusk. My colleagues joke that I've spent more time among the trees than among people. They're not wrong. I've always preferred the forest company to that of humans. The whisper of wind through leaves, the distant calls of birds, the gentle patter of rain on the canopy overhead. These sounds have been a soundtrack to my life for over 2 decades. But there's one part of Ravenscrag that even I avoid when possible, a section in the northernmost region that doesn't appear on public maps. Local forestry workers call it the boundary, though what it bounds or separates, no one seems to know. The old-timers warn new rangers not to linger there after dark, especially in the rain. Most dismiss these warnings as superstitious nonsense. I never did. There's something different about those woods. The trees grow at odd angles, as if straining away from something at the center. Wildlife is noticeably absent. No birds nesting in the branches. No evidence of foxes or badgers or even insects. The light filters differently through the leaves, casting shadows that seem to move when viewed from the corner of your eye. And then there are the markers, ancient standing stones, rough-hewn and weathered by centuries of rain and wind. They form a rough circle about half a mile in diameter. Each stone bears the same primitive carving, a vertical line with 3 horizontal slashes crossing it. The archaeological surveys conducted in the 1970s dated them to the early Bronze Age, though their purpose remains a mystery. The official theory is that they marked a burial ground or ceremonial site, though no evidence of either has ever been found. I had managed to avoid assignment to the boundary sector for nearly 15 years. But last November, a combination of staff shortages and a severe weather system moving it meant I was tasked with checking the drainage channels in that area. Heavy rainfall had been forecast, and there were concerns about potential flooding affecting the neighboring farmland. The days started gray and foreboding, with low clouds hanging like bruises over the landscape. By the time I parked my Land Rover at the service track that led to the boundary, a light drizzle had begun, speckling my windscreen and dampening the already sodden ground. I sat for a moment, engine idling, wipers sweeping lazily across the glass. Part of me wanted to radio in, make some excuse about vehicle trouble, anything to avoid walking into those woods. But professional pride won out. I'd been avoiding this place for years based on nothing but folklore and my own unease. It was time to face whatever irrational fear had taken root in my mind. I gathered my equipment, rain gear, torch, radio, GPS, and the tools needed to clear blocked drainage channels, and set off down the muddy track. The forest closed around me almost immediately, the trees pressing in from both sides, their branches forming a canopy that the weak November daylight struggled to penetrate. The rain intensified as I walked, drumming steadily on my waterproof hood. I found myself focusing on that sound, using its rhythm to pace my breathing, to calm the inexplicable anxiety that tightened my chest with each step deeper into the boundary. It took about 40 minutes to reach the first drainage ditch. It was partially blocked with fallen leaves and branches, but nothing a few minutes' work couldn't clear. I logged the condition in my notebook, now slightly damp despite my efforts to keep it protected, and continued on my route. The second and third drainage points were similarly unremarkable, just routine maintenance in difficult conditions. I began to think I'd been foolish, allowing old rangers' tales to unsettle me for all these years. And then I reached the fourth point, located in the very center of the stone circle. I knew immediately that something was wrong. The drainage channel, which had been a simple earthen ditch, had been altered, widened and deepened into a rough-hewn trench about 6 feet across and 8 feet deep. The sides were too straight, too precise to have been caused by natural erosion. This was deliberate excavation. More disturbing were the symbols carved into the exposed soil of the trench walls. Dozens of them. Variations on the same mark found on the boundary stones, but more elaborate, more intricate. They seemed to shimmer slightly in the rain, as if the water was reluctant to touch them. I approached the edge cautiously, playing my torch beam along the strange markings. They had a disorienting quality, drawing the eye in and then seeming to shift when looked at directly. At the bottom of the trench was about 2 feet of standing water, dark and perfectly still despite the rain striking its surface. As I crouched by the edge, my radio crackled to life, making me start. Ranger Harlow, this is Control. Radio check, over. The voice of Diane, the day controller, was distorted by static but recognizable. I unclipped the radio from my belt. Control, this is Harlow. Receiving you. Currently at Drainage Point 4 in Sector North. Have discovered some unauthorized excavation work. Appears recent. Over. The radio hiss was static for several seconds before Diane's voice returned, now barely audible beneath the interference. Say again, Kent. Signal breaking, your position. Control. I am at the central point in the boundary area. There's been some digging here. Looks deliberate. Should I investigate further? Over. More static, then fragments of words. Return, immediately forecast severe weight. The transmission dissolved into white noise, then silence. I tried again several times, but received no response. Cell service was non-existent in this part of the forest, so the radio was my only link to the outside world. I checked my watch. 15:37. Daylight, what little penetrated the canopy, would begin fading within the hour. The sensible course of action was to head back, report the excavation properly, and let a team return to investigate in better conditions. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a nagging sense that this discovery was important, that I needed to understand what I was looking at before leaving. Professional curiosity, I told myself, though deep down I knew it was something else, something more like compulsion. I moved around the perimeter of the trench, photographing the strange symbols with my phone. They seemed to be arranged in patterns, forming larger designs that only became apparent when viewing several at once. There was a logic to them, a language I couldn't decipher, but could sense the shape of. The rain was falling harder now, running in rivulets down my face despite my hood. The forest had grown darker, the clouds overhead thickening to an ominous slate gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, continuous growl like some great beast stirring. I should leave, I thought, now, before the storm worsens. Then I noticed something in the water at the bottom of the trench, a darker shape against a dark liquid, something solid and cylindrical, about the size of a coffee can. I shone my torch directly on it. The object appeared to be made of stone, carved with the same symbols that adorned the trench walls. It looked ancient, yet somehow unmarred by time, its edges crisp and precise. I needed to retrieve it. The thought came with such force that I didn't question it. I needed that object, needed to see it up close, to touch it, looking around. I found a fallen branch long enough to reach the water. I lay on my stomach at the edge of the trench, stretching the branch down to try and hook the stone cylinder. The angle was awkward, and the first 2 attempts merely caused the object to shift position slightly. On the 3rd try, the branch connected with the cylinder, pushing it towards a trench wall where I might be able to reach it if I extended my arm down into the water. I leaned further over the edge, balancing precariously as I stretched my arm into the trench. My fingertips brushed the top of the stone object, cold and slick with moisture. I strained further, trying to get a grip on it. That's when I felt something grip me back. A hand, cold, strong, and undeniably human, closed around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but the grip was like iron, holding me in place as something began to rise from the dark water. A face emerged, a man's face, pale as milk, with eyes so dark they seemed to have no whites at all. His features were gaunt, almost skeletal, skin stretched tight over prominent bones. His hair was long and black, plastered to his skull by the water. I tried to scream, but terror had frozen my vocal cords. I thrashed wildly, trying to break his grip, to pull myself back from the edge of the trench. "You're late," he said, his voice a whisper that somehow carried clearly above the sound of rain. "We've been waiting so long. Let go of me." I finally managed to gasp, finding my voice at last. His grip tightened, and I felt other hands now, emerging from the water to clutch at my arm. Smaller hands, larger hands, old and young, all with the same preternatural strength, all pulling me inexorably toward the water. "The boundary weakens," the pale man continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "The markers fail. You must restore them. You must take my place." "What are you talking about?" I gasped, still struggling futilely against their combined strength. "Let me go." "Once every 100 years," he said, his dark eyes fixed on mine. "The warden must be replaced. The old returns to the earth. The new takes up the watch." Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the trench in a brief, brilliant flash. In that moment, I saw that the water was full of people, men and women of various ages, all with the same pale skin and dark eyes, all reaching upward with grasping hands. Some wore clothing that looked centuries old, others more modern dress, now rotting and draped with aquatic weeds. And on their foreheads, each bore a symbol carved into the flesh, the same mark found on the boundary stones. "No!" I whimpered, using my free hand to claw at the muddy ground, trying to find purchase. "I don't understand. I don't want this. One has nothing to do with it." The pale man replied, "You heard the call. You came to the center. You reached for the marker. The choice is made." More hands grabbed my arm, my shoulder, the front of my jacket. They were pulling me over the edge now, into the water with them. The rain was torrential, plastering my clothes and my body, making the ground slick and treacherous. In desperation, I twisted violently to one side and managed to free my radio from my belt. With all my strength, I smashed it into the pale man's face. He recoiled, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench my arm free and scramble backward from the edge. I staggered to my feet and ran, not caring about direction, just needing to put distance between myself and that terrible trench. The rain was a solid wall now, reducing visibility to mere feet. Lightning flashed continuously, thunder cracking directly overhead. The storm had peaked directly above the boundary. As if drawn to it, I splashed through puddles and slid in mud, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up from the ground to snare my feet. The forest itself felt hostile, trying to slow my escape. Behind me, I heard them. Not footsteps, but a slithering, squelching sound. The noise of soaked bodies dragging themselves through mud. And voices calling my name in a horrible chorus. "Ranger Harlow, Warden Harlow, come back. You cannot escape what you are chosen for." I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress, measured only in heartbeats and gasping breaths. Eventually, I broke through the tree line onto the service road, where I'd parked my Land Rover. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. As I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. They stood at the edge of the forest, a line of pale figures, their clothes and hair dripping, their dark eyes fixed on me. The pale man was in the center, the wound on his face already healing, closing like water absorbing a dropped stone. He raised his hand, palm outward, and I saw that the same symbol from the boundary stones was carved into his flesh. As I watched, it began to fade. The edges softening, the cuts closing. Your time will come. I heard him say, though it was impossible for his voice to carry through closed windows and the sound of rain. The boundary must be maintained. The warden must be replaced. I slammed the Land Rover into gear and accelerated away, tires spraying mud and water. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I reached the main park road 10 miles away. When I finally reported into headquarters, soaked and trembling, I said nothing about pale figures in a flooded trench, nothing about ancient wardens or failing boundaries. I described a flash flood, a near miss, a fortune escape. They were concerned, sympathetic, but unsurprised given the severity of the storm. That night, alone in my cottage on the edge of the park, I examined myself in the bathroom mirror. There on my forehead, barely visible but undeniably present, was the beginning of a mark, not a cut or a scrape, but a slight discoloration in the shape of a vertical line, the first stroke of the boundary symbol. I requested a transfer to another park, as far from Ravenscrag as possible. It's been approved, and I leave next month. Perhaps distance will matter. Perhaps whatever connection was formed that day can be broken by putting enough miles between myself and the boundary. But in my dreams, I stand in that central trench, water lapping at my waist. Around me, the previous wardens float just beneath the surface, their dark eyes open, watching, waiting. And beyond the boundary stones, something massive moves in the deeper darkness. Something ancient and patient and hungry. The pale man speaks to me in these dreams, teaching me the meaning of the symbols, explaining my duties as warden, how I must maintain the boundary, how I must eventually choose my own replacement, how the alternative is unthinkable. I wake from these dreams with new marks on my forehead, the symbol gradually becoming more defined. I cover with makeup during the day, but it grows clearer each morning. The transfer may not save me. I suspect nothing will, but I have to try. Are you listening to this in the forest? Can you hear the rain on the leaves overhead? If so, I urge you, pay attention to where you step. Notice which paths seem to draw you deeper, which clearings call to you. Be wary of standing stones and ancient markers. And if you find yourself near water, dark and still despite the rainfall, do not reach in, no matter what treasures you think you see beneath the surface. For boundaries exist for a reason, and wardens are always watching for replacements, always listening for footsteps in the rain. Have you ever heard your own voice coming back to you when you weren't expecting it? Not just a familiar phenomenon of sound bouncing off distant surfaces, but something more intimate, more unsettling, as if the words were being spoken by someone else who knows exactly how you sound? I'm asking because I need to know if I'm alone in this experience, if what happened to me is unique, or if others have encountered it too, perhaps even you. I've been a forest ranger at Graymoor National Park for nearly 9 years. It's one of the lesser-known reserves in northern England. About 8,000 acres of dense woodland, craggy hills, and peat bogs. The kind of place tourists drive past on their way to more picturesque locations. This suits me perfectly. I've never been comfortable in crowds. The quiet isolation of the deep forest has always felt more like home than any place filled with people. There's a particular area in the eastern section of the park that locals call the Echo Woods, not marked on any official map. It's a roughly circular region about 2 miles in diameter where the acoustic properties are unusual. Stand in the right spot and whisper, and your voice will come back to you with perfect clarity, despite there being no cliff faces or structures nearby to reflect the sound. Most dismiss it as an atmospheric quirk, some combination of topography and tree density creating the conditions for this phenomenon. The more superstitiously inclined have other theories, of course. They speak of old rituals performed there, of prehistoric settlements, whose inhabitants believed the echoes were ancestors speaking from beyond the veil. I never paid much attention to these stories. Scientific curiosity occasionally led me to experiment with the echoes when patrols took me through that section, but I considered it nothing more than an interesting natural anomaly until the night of the storm. It was late October, and the tail end of what the meteorologists were calling a weather bomb was sweeping across the north of England. 3 days of relentless rain had saturated the ground, causing minor flooding in the lower regions of the park and making the trails treacherous with mud and fallen debris. I was tasked with checking several of the remote emergency shelters scattered throughout the park. Small, sturdy cabins stocked with basic supplies for hikers caught in sudden weather changes. Most of these inspections have been routine, despite the challenging conditions. The final shelter on my list was the one located in the Echo Woods. It was the most isolated of all the park's emergency structures, situated near an old surveyor's path that had fallen into disuse years ago. The rain had intensified throughout the afternoon, and by the time I approached the Echo Woods, it was falling in heavy sheets, reducing visibility to mere yards. My waterproofs had long since surrendered to the deluge, and I was soaked to the skin, my boots squelching with each step. The daylight was fading rapidly, a premature dusk brought on by the storm clouds hanging low overhead. I switched on my torch, its beam cutting a narrow path through the gathering darkness. The trees in the Echo Woods are different from those in the rest of the park. Older, more gnarled, with branches that seem to reach toward you as you pass beneath them. Even in daylight, there's something unsettling about their twisted forms, the way they seem to have grown in deliberate patterns rather than following the random chaos of nature. In the rain and gloom, they were positively sinister, dark sentinels standing watch over a domain where humans were merely tolerated, not welcomed. I followed the faint trace of the old surveyor's path, occasionally consulting my GPS to ensure I wasn't wandering off course. The rain drumming against my hood created a constant background noise that made it difficult to hear anything else, a fact that would become important later. After about 40 minutes of difficult hiking, I reached a small clearing where the emergency shelter stood, a squat wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof designed to shed snow and rain. It looked sound from the outside, though the small porch was littered with fallen branches and forest debris. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, grateful to be out of rain, if only briefly. The interior was basic but functional. For bunks built into the walls, a small table with benches, a cast iron wood stove for heat, and shelves stocked with tinned food, bottled water, first aid supplies, and emergency equipment. My inspection was quick and methodical, checking for leaks, ensuring supplies were intact and hadn't been pilfered by hikers or animals, making sure the chemical toilet in the small back room was serviceable. Everything seemed in order, though there was an unusual amount of dust on surfaces, suggesting it had been some time since anyone had sought refuge here. I made notes in my waterproof logbook, then paused to consider my options. The original plan had been to complete the inspection and return to the ranger station before full darkness set in. But given the deteriorating conditions and the rapidly fading light, attempting to navigate the difficult terrain in near zero visibility seemed foolhardy. The safety protocols were clear. If conditions became hazardous, rangers were to seek shelter rather than risk injury. I radioed in my decision to remain at the cabin until morning, receiving a crackly acknowledgement from the station before the signal degraded completely. The storm was interfering with communications, not unusual in these remote areas during severe weather. I set about making the shelter as comfortable as possible for my unplanned overnight stay. I lit the wood stove with a dry kindling store beside it, changed into the spare clothing I carried in my waterproof pack, and laid my sodden outer garments near the stove to dry. The warmth was welcome after hours in the cold rain, and I felt some of the tension leaving my muscles as I prepared a simple meal for my rations. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the small windows with a sound like thrown gravel. Occasionally, thunder would rumble overhead, the sound rolling across the forest like some vast creature stirring. It was during one such thunderclap, as I sat at the rough-hewn table writing up my inspection report, that I first heard it, the echo that wasn't an echo. Hello. The word was softly spoken, barely audible above the storm, but distinctly clear. It seemed to come from outside the shelter, perhaps from the edge of the clearing. I froze, pen hovering above paper, listening intently. Several seconds passed with only the sounds of the storm. It must have been my imagination, I thought, or perhaps some quirk of the wind through the trees, creating a sound that my mind, primed by the knowledge of being in the echo woods, had interpreted as a word. I returned to my report. A minute later, it came again. Hello. Louder this time, more distinct, and undeniably in my own voice. I stood up so quickly that the bench scraped loudly against the wooden floor. My heart was suddenly racing, adrenaline flooding my system with the primal certainty that something was wrong. Who's there? I called, moving to the window that faced the clearing. The glass was streaming with rain, distorted my view of the outside world, but I could see no movement, no sign of another person. No answer came, just the relentless sound of the storm. I considered my options. It seemed unlikely that anyone else would be in this remote section of the park during such weather. If someone was outside, a lost hiker, perhaps they would have approached the shelter directly, not called from the tree line. After a minute of indecision, I reached for my torch and waterproof jacket. If someone needed help, I couldn't ignore them, regardless of how strange the circumstances. I opened the door cautiously, shining my torch beam across the clearing. The rain was still falling heavily, and the wind whipped it into my face as I stepped onto the small porch. Hello, I called. Is someone there? This is Ranger Keller. If you need assistance, please identify yourself. My words were swallowed by the storm, the wind carrying them away almost as soon as they left my mouth. I swept the torch beam methodically from left to right across the edge of the clearing, trying to penetrate the wall of darkness beyond. Nothing. No movement. No sign of human presence. I was about to retreat back into the shelter when I heard again my own voice coming from the trees directly ahead of me. This is Ranger Keller. If you need assistance, please identify yourself. The words were repeated exactly as I had spoken them, with the same inflections, the same slight northern accent that I've never quite managed to shed. But there was something subtly wrong about the voice, a hollowness, as if the words had been spoken into an empty barrel. Fear crawled up my spine like a physical presence. This was no natural echo. The timing was wrong, the clarity too perfect despite the interfering noise of the storm. Who's there? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing panic churning in my gut. Show yourself. From the darkness beyond my torch beam came the response. Who's there? Show yourself. Again, my own voice, but with that same empty quality, like a recording played in a vast, empty room. I backed toward the shelter door, unwilling to take my eyes off the tree line. The rational part of my mind was frantically searching for explanations. Some local playing a prank, perhaps, or a recording device planted by mischievous hikers. But deeper instincts were screaming that this was something else entirely. Something older and more dangerous than human mischief. Just as my hand found the door handle behind me, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A darker shadow separating itself from the general darkness between the trees. My torch beam caught it briefly before it slipped sideways out of the light. It was roughly human-shaped, but seemed composed of something less substantial than flesh, a density in the air, like fog or smoke that had gathered itself into a form that approximated a person. Where the light struck it, It seemed to absorb the beam rather than reflect it, creating a black silhouette outlined in a faint, hazy glow. And though it had no discernible features, I had the distinct, horrifying impression that it was wearing my face. I practically fell backward through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt with trembling hands. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It's nothing," I said aloud, trying to reassure myself with the sound of my own voice, my real voice. A trick of the light, an hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. "It's nothing," a trick of the light, an hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. The words came through the wooden walls of the shelter as clearly as if whatever was outside was standing right beside me, speaking directly into my ear. My exact words, my exact voice, but hollow and wrong. I backed away from the door until my shoulders hit the opposite wall. The small cabin, which had seemed so safe and secure moments before, now felt like a trap. The windows were too small to climb through, and the only exit was the door that stood between me and whatever was out there. For several minutes, I stood frozen, listening to the storm and straining to hear any other sounds. The mimicking voice had fallen silent. Perhaps whatever it was, had gone. Gradually, my racing heart slowed. My breathing steadied. The rational explanations I had tried to convince myself of earlier began to seem more plausible. Perhaps it had been kids from a nearby village, playing some elaborate prank with recording equipment. Or maybe the stress and isolation had triggered some sort of auditory hallucination. I moved back to the table, though I kept glancing nervously at the door and windows. The warmth from the wood stove was comforting, and I told myself that by morning, in daylight, the whole incident would seem far less sinister. I was wrong. Around midnight, as I lay on one of the bunks trying to sleep despite my lingering unease, the mimicry began again, this time not repeating words I had just spoken, but things I had said throughout the day. Radio communications with the ranger station, muttered comments to myself as I trudged through the rain, even private thoughts that I was certain I hadn't voiced aloud. Eastern shelter secure, minimal maintenance required. Should have brought the heavier waterproofs. If this rain doesn't let up, the Blackwater Creek will breach its banks. Each phrase was delivered in that hollow imitation of my voice, sometimes from near the door, sometimes from beside a window, as if the thing outside was circling the cabin, testing for weaknesses. I sat up, clutching my sleeping bag around me like a shield. "What do you want?" I called, my voice cracking with fear. The response came immediately. "What do you want?" But this time it was followed by something new, a sound that resembled laughter, but distorted, all wrong, like the mirth of someone that had only observed human emotion but never experienced it. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the bunk furthest from any window or door, torch in one hand, the emergency flare gun from the shelter supplies in the other. The voice continued its mimicry intermittently, sometimes repeating my recent words, sometimes dredging up phrases from conversations I'd had days or even weeks earlier. Most disturbing of all were the private thoughts, things I was certain I had never said aloud, anxieties about my recent breakup, concerns about my elderly mother's health, contemplations about leaving the ranger service to pursue a long-abandoned dream of teaching. How could it know these things? How could it speak thoughts that had never left the confines of my own mind? Toward dawn, as a gray, watery light began to seep through the windows, the voice finally fell silent. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, and the wind had died down to an occasional gust that stirred the branches of the nearby trees. I waited another hour, watching the clearing gradually emerge from darkness, before I dared to open the door. The ground was sodden, covered in debris from the storm, fallen branches, torn leaves, pine cones blown from the trees. But there was no sign of any human presence. No footprints in the mud besides my own from the previous evening. Eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Echo Woods, I hastily packed my gear and set off back toward the main park trail. The going was difficult. The path was slick with mud, and fallen trees blocked the way in several places, forcing me to make detours through the dense undergrowth. But it wasn't until I had been walking for about 20 minutes that I realized something was wrong. The surveyor's path should have led me directly out of the Echo Woods after about half a mile, yet the trees around me were still the same twisted, ancient specimens characteristic of that particular area. I checked my GPS, only to find it had malfunctioned during the night, perhaps due to water damage from the storm. The screen showed only a flickering mess of pixels. My compass, however, was working fine and indicated I was heading east. Exactly as I should be, I continued walking, pushing my pace despite the difficult terrain. Another 20 minutes passed, then 30. The Echo Wood showed no sign of thinning out. If anything, the trees seemed to be growing denser, the undergrowth more tangled. A sick feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. I should have reached the main trail by now, even accounting for the poor conditions and the detours. I had been walking for nearly an hour. The Echo Woods were not that large. I stopped to catch my breath and try to orient myself. Without the GPS, I was relying on my knowledge of the park's layout and the position of the sun, now occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds. According to both, I was heading in the right direction, yet somehow I remained trapped within the Echo Woods. It was then that I heard it again, my own voice coming from somewhere behind me. I should have reached the main trail by now. I whirled around, nearly losing my footing on the slippery ground. There was nothing there, just trees and fog, and the gentle patter of residual raindrops falling from the canopy overhead. "Who are you?" I shouted, fear giving way to anger born of desperation. "What do you want from me?" This time, the response didn't come as an immediate mimicry. Instead, there was silence for several long seconds. Then, Ranger Keller. Just my name and my voice, but spoken with an inflection I had never used, almost like a question, or perhaps an experiment, as if whatever was speaking was trying out the shape of the words. "What do you want?" I demanded again, turning slowly, try to locate the source of the voice. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the mist that wound between the trees. To be. The response chilled me more deeply than any mimicry had, because this time, though the voice was still recognizably mine in timbre and tone, the cadence was all wrong, halting, uncertain, like someone learning to speak for the first time. "I don't understand," I said, continuing to turn, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "What does that mean?" "To be you." A movement caught my eye. That same shadow figure I had glimpsed the night before, standing between two ancient oaks about 20 yards away. In the gray morning light, it seemed more substantial than it had in darkness, still composed of something like dense fog or smoke, but now with more defined features. Features that, with a shock of recognition, I realized were an approximation of my own. My face, but wrong, like a reflection in dark water, distorted and fluid. "You can't be me," I said, backing away slowly. "I am me." The figure tilted its head, a too smooth movement that no human neck could replicate. "For now," it said, in that hollow version of my voice. It took a step forward, and I noticed the first time that where it moved, it left no impression on the forest floor. Fallen leaves remained undisturbed. Muddy puddles didn't ripple. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, abandoning the path entirely, focused only on putting distance between myself and that terrible mimicry of my form. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. My lungs burned with exertion, and my clothes were soon soaked through with a mixture of sweat and the water shaken from the vegetation I disturbed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose meaning in that place. But eventually, physical exhaustion forced me to stop, collapsing against the trunk of a massive oak, gasping for breath. As my heart rate gradually slowed, I became aware of the silence. No birdsong. No rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, not even the sound of wind through the trees, just the occasional drip of water from leaves, and my own labored breathing. And then, from directly behind me, in a voice identical to my own, "Tired, Ranger Keller?" I spun around so fast that I nearly fell. The shadow figure stood mere feet away, its approximation of my face now more detailed, more accurate. It was like looking into a three-dimensional mirror made of smoke and mist. "Were you?" I whispered, too exhausted and terrified to run again. "Echo," it replied, gesturing vaguely at the surrounding woods. "We are the Echo." "We." I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see more of these shadow creatures emerging from between the trees. All echoes, all reflections, all impressions left behind. They spoke haltingly, as if assembling the concept with difficulty. "Humans speak. We answer. Humans think. We hear. Humans feel. We learn." A horrible understanding began to dawn on me. "You feed on it," I said, "on our words, our thoughts, our emotions." The figure didn't confirm or deny this, but its head tilted again in that unervingly fluid way. "You are alone here. No one comes to the Echo Woods now. No voices, no thoughts, no feelings. We hunger. So, what? You want to eat my emotions? My thoughts?" I was backing away again, though I knew running had proven futile before. "No." The single word hung in the air between us. "Then, want to wear you, want to be you. Leave the woods. Find more voices, more thoughts, more feelings." Ice seemed to flood my veins as I understood its intention. This thing wanted to take my place, to somehow assume my identity and leave the Echo Woods, using me as a vessel or a disguise. "That's not possible," I said, trying to sound confident despite my terror. "You can't just become me." "Already beginning," it replied, and raised what passed for a hand to its face. I watched in horror as the smoky approximation of my features became more solid, more detailed. The lines at the corners of my eyes, the small scar on my chin from a childhood accident, even the slight asymmetry of my mouth when relaxed. It was like watching a sculptor refine a work, adding detail after detail with terrible precision. And as it did so, I became aware of a strange sensation, a hollowing out, as if something essential was being drawn from me. My thoughts seemed to move more sluggishly. Memories became harder to grasp, slipping away like minnows in a stream. I raised my own hand to my face and was gripped by a new terror. My fingers met skin that felt less substantial, less real somehow. "Stop." I gasped, the word feeling foreign in my mouth, as if I was forgetting how to speak. "Please stop." The Echo creature continued its transformation, ignoring my plea. It was becoming more solid by the second, while I felt increasingly insubstantial, a reflection rather than a real person. In desperation, I lunged forward and seized it by what passed for shoulders. I expected my hand to pass through its misty form, but instead, they met resistance, a cold, solid surface that felt like wet stone. The creature seemed as surprised by this as I was, its borrowed features registering shock. We grappled briefly, an absurd struggle between a man and his reflection. Then it shoved me away with unexpected strength, sending me sprawling into a deep puddle left by the storm. As I fell, my head struck a partially submerged rock. Pain exploded through my skull, and darkness crowded the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was my own face looking down at me, my face on the echo creature, now almost completely solid, almost completely real, almost completely me. I awoke to the sound of voices, human voices calling my name, for a disorienting moment. I couldn't remember who I was or where I was. Then reality rushed back in a flood of terror. Here! I tried to shout, but my voice emerged as a barely audible whisper. I'm here. Footsteps approached. 2 rangers from the Park Service, part of a search party sent out when I failed to check in that morning. They helped me to my feet, concerned by the head wound I had sustained and my general state of confusion. As they led me from the Echo Woods, supporting me when my legs threatened to give way. I tried to explain what had happened. The words came out jumbled, incoherent. They exchanged worried glances over my head, clearly attributing my ramblings to concussion I had likely suffered. It wasn't until we reached the ranger station, and I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror, that the full horror of what had happened became clear. The face that looked back at me was mine, but subtly wrong, like a photograph that's been digitally altered in ways too small to immediately identify. My eyes seemed shallower somehow, lacking the depth they should have had. My expressions came a split second after I tried to form them, as if there was a delay between intention and action. Medical tests revealed nothing physically wrong beyond concussion and mild hypothermia. No doctor could find a reason for the persistent feeling that I was somehow less substantial than before, that parts of me had been hollowed out and replaced with something else. I took a leave of absence from the Ranger service shortly after the incident. I couldn't bear to be in the park, knowing what waited in the Echo Woods, knowing that something wearing a more perfect version of my face might be out there, learning to be human, feeding on the voices and thoughts and emotions of others. Because I'm certain that's what happened. The creature and I struggled, both of us partially transformed. It becoming more like me becoming more like it. But the transformation wasn't completed. It fled when the search party approached, taking with it pieces of who I am. But not everything. Not yet. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my flat at night, I hear my own voice coming from the empty rooms, speaking thoughts I've had during the day, repeating conversations I've had with others. And sometimes when I pass a mirror or a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of my reflection moving independently, its mouth forming words I haven't spoken. Not finished yet. Still hungry. Still learning. Soon. I've begun recording myself sleeping. The footage shows me speaking in that hollow, wrong version of my voice, having conversations with something that doesn't appear on camera, sharing more of myself, losing more with each exchange. I'm telling you this as a warning. If you're ever in Graymoor National Park, stay away from the eastern section, from the place they call the Echo Woods. Don't speak there. Don't even think too loudly. And if you hear your own voice coming back to you when it shouldn't, when there's nothing to reflect the sound, when the timing is wrong, when it says things you've only thought but never spoken aloud, run. Run and don't look back. Because the echo is hungry, and it's learning. And somewhere out there is a version of me that isn't me at all, becoming more perfect in its impersonation with each passing day. Are you certain the voice in your head as you read this is entirely your own? Are you sure the face you see in the mirror moves exactly when you do, says exactly what you say, thinks exactly what you think? Or has the echo found you too? Listen carefully to your own voice, and be very afraid if it answers when you haven't spoken.